Hello, and welcome to our session, Guiding Principles for Equity-Driven Professional Learning for Gifted Teachers. My name is Katie Lewis, and I'm an associate professor at York College of Pennsylvania. And this is my colleague, co-creator, Angela Novak. Angela?
Hi, my name is Angela Novak, and I am at East Carolina University in North Carolina. Sorry, I'm the subtitle called you Kitty, so I'm giggling a little bit. It's Katie for the subtitle record. All right, so we are going to get started, Kitty. We have created these guiding principles of equity-driven professional learning, and we are starting with what is or was the need. I hope this is not a truly needed slide. I hope we understand that there is a great need for equity-driven professional learning, not just in our field, but across the field of education. We first want to acknowledge that while these equity-driven principles have been part of Katie and my written works. Actually, Katie started these equity-driven principles and then part of our work for some time. The last written article we have in production was also with our great friend and co-author on several different things, Dr. Chris Weber from the University of North Florida. So we do have that article put there for you to see. It's in Gifted Child Today in 2020. And one graphic that I really like, well, not like, but that I think shows a really great example is this one here in the center, where you can see that the example is what some people feel the motto, the group Black Lives Matter, or the saying Black Lives Matter. People see that as many different things. It is a non-profit organization. It is a saying. It's many things. What it really means and where we exist now as a nation, as a society, in education, in so many different ways. And I think that really shows what truly is the need. And on the right is a quote that is from our article. The competencies and principles that our guiding principles are based on come from several different places. These are research-based principles for equity-driven professional learning. And we compiled them from literature out of many different sources. Obviously, equity sources, research review, literature review on a lot of different equity and professional learning, equity in general, anti-racism sources, and work in terms of equity literacy. But in terms of standards and competencies, we used NAGC standards, NAGC and CEC standards, learning forward standards, and the 8 competencies for culturally responsive teaching that came out of this New America report written by Yunus in 2019. When we look at equity in professional learning, one of the things that, as I mentioned, the equity literacy work that we use is Paul Gorski and Katie Swalwell's Equity Literacy for All in 2015 is the grounding theory. And then in 2019, there were equity literacy principles identified in one of Paul Gorski's articles. And those were equity literacy principles that summed up that earlier work. And those are just simple ways of sort of summing up the basic ideas of equity literacy. And it's divided into these 5 different principles. And the first is the direct confrontation principle. And this is basically just starting with The first question you ask is, how does racism exist in our system as we know it? It starts with acknowledging that racism exists and how it operates in the system. The basic, and I mentioned this if you listen to our other presentation, is if you are questioning whether or not racism exists in what you are working with, then that's not where you need to be as an organization. It's how is it existing in your system at the moment. The second principle is the redistribution principle. And this is an equity literacy principle that talks about you need to review the processes, policies, and figure out how they are currently marginalizing groups and what you need to do to fix them. The third principle is the prioritization principle. And this is the basic understanding that you need to take the students that have been minoritized and marginalized and prioritize them, because they have been minoritized and marginalized for far too long. And one thing that Paul Gorski says is, remember that in inequitable contexts, equality, attending equally to everybody's interests, reproduces inequity. So you need to focus on those that have been minoritized and marginalized for too long. Then the equity ideology principle, and that is you need to focus on equity as a lens, not an idea. Everything that you view is viewed through the lens of equity. It's not a strategy. It's not a, okay, now we're going to work on our equity things today, and tomorrow we're going to work on something else. Equity is a lens that you look through everything with that view. And the last principle is truly one of my favorite principles. Just funny to think about equity principles as a favorite principle. And this is the fix injustice, not kids principle. And with this, it's the idea that we don't need another quick fix strategy to fix kids. We need to fix the system. We need to fix the structural inequities that are plaguing the children, that are plaguing the system. We don't need another way of fixing the kids. What you see on the right here, and you see a tiny little picture of Dr. Donna Ford on the right. This is from a webinar that she did with Dr. Luke Ford this summer. And this is this cycle of deficit thinking. And she just talks about the less we know about others, the more we make up. And it's just this endless cycle of creating stories that we make up because we don't know what's really happening in the children's lives. So we just make assumptions. And it's just a cycle that we need to break. So on we go to our principles. Our first guiding principle is taking a pulse. And this is a really important principle that you probably recognize in terms of your own K-12 classrooms. And this is assessment. And this is the importance of using data to guide what you're doing. And so when you are starting a unit, you may give a pre-assessment. Throughout the unit, you give ongoing assessments. And why do you do this? So you know where your babies are. So you know what they're learning. So you know where to go next. In professional learning, it's the same way. And it is just as essential in adult learning. You need to know where your adult babies are, and you need to know where you're going next. And when we're talking about issues of race and racism, when we're talking about issues of cultural identity, when we're talking about issues of anti-racism, when we're talking about anything that is particularly difficult and has a lot of emotions running high, knowing where they are to start with and knowing how they're feeling is incredibly important. And so this is a really essential piece to keep an eye on, not just at the beginning, but as you go through the professional learning experiences. The second guiding principal, and you're going to be shocked that a gifted advocates are telling you is differentiation. So individualized professional learning plans. Look at the data you're given and tailor this professional learning to the teacher's needs. You can adjust the professional learning by length, by speed, have different groups based on what that data is telling you, but not all professional learning for all teachers needs to be the same. It can be done in groups. You can tier the professional learning. You may have different teachers read different books, have different plans, but not every teacher is at the same place, especially in terms of where they are in terms of racism, where they are in terms of identity. Not everybody is in the same place, and not everybody needs to be in the same training. And our third principle is establishing a safe zone. And with establishing a safe zone, this word, the idea of safe zone, does get tossed around a lot. And so when we say safe zone, one thing that is important here is that we mean that we're establishing guidelines, we're establishing norms for the group, we're developing trust, and we're ensuring confidentiality. We do not mean that this is a place where you can say anything and you're safe and you get a free pass. That's not what safe zone means in this context. So there is a implication sometimes that safe zone means those things, that I can say anything I want. Hey, it's a safe zone. That's not what that means. Safe zone specifically means at the beginning, we are establishing those guidelines. We are establishing what the norms are for this group, and we're creating that space of trust in order to be able to have conversations. There's some that word, the idea around, or change the wording here and call the zones brave zones or brave spaces, because of, looking at this different vocabulary. And there is sometimes the idea of having the different vocabulary term make that difference. And looking at the idea of a safe space is one that is a judgment-free zone, whereas a brave space, the idea is pushing for dialogue and holding people accountable, and looking at the difference between those two. And I think that really can matter. But I think what's really important is at the very beginning, you establish what does this, whatever zone you're creating, whatever name you call it, you're establishing what does this zone mean in this space. If you're calling it safe, if you're calling it brave, you have to establish what does this mean. Making sure people understand that this does not mean you're doing whatever you want, you're saying whatever you want. And one thing that I think is particularly important is this idea of you need friction to strike a spark, making sure that these conversations are often hard and typically uncomfortable, but it's that dissonance which helps us grow. And this is my chance to grab some water, and Katie's going to take it away.
We've talked about the first 3 of the 7 principles. And so all of these principles you should be considering whenever you're developing any kind of professional learning. So the next one is going beyond the tip of the iceberg. So when we think of an iceberg, you only can see the very top of it, but what's below it is massive underneath, right? So with this idea of the iceberg, if we think about culture, a lot of times we can only see the very top of the culture, right? So if you think about in schools, a lot of times we have different months where we celebrate different cultures, or we have a cafeteria day where we have a certain type of food. Well, those are just the top of the iceberg, right? We want to get to the heart of the culture and the heart of our students. So in our professional learning, we want to make sure that we are examining cultures. We're thinking thinking about culture awareness in the classroom, and we're really focusing on that gifted piece and how giftedness looks different in our different classroom settings and different cultural settings. So our next principle is bridging the gap between the home and the school. This principle is very, very important because if we think about education, we have our triangle, right? We have our teacher, our student, and our parents or our families at home. And so sometimes when we're developing professional learning, we think about it more just from the teacher's perspective. But we want to think about also how can we engage our parents and our communities in our school, especially related to our gifted kiddos. So thinking about professional learning that would also bring the families in, both to learn about your gifted program, but also so you can learn from the families. Inviting them to come be expert speakers at your professional learning sessions is really important so they can share their strengths and help everybody understand and get on the same page. With this, we want to think about cultural awareness, right? And that perspective, especially for our gifted kiddos. So the next one, the principle is identifying our grows and glows. And this kind of gets back to that taking the pulse piece of the principles and the idea that everybody has things that works really well. We all get really excited when we did something and like, oh, this is great, right? But a lot of times teachers, especially in elementary school, we tend to go into our classroom and we shut the door, right? Or now it's our Zoom room, right? And we're in our Zoom classroom. And so we're very isolated. So sometimes somebody's doing something really awesome that really works. And so we want to be able to have those conversations. So inviting our teachers to share what's working really well with them, what strategy tips do you have to share with us, but connecting it to that cultural competence and to those gifted learners. So if you have a high ESL population, you know, sometimes we struggle with how do I bring those kids into my gifted curriculum that hasn't been adapted? And so maybe somebody has some tips or things that they have done and they have modified that worked really well. So we want to share that. And then we also want to share how we can grow, right? So saying, I'm really struggling with this. I'm not quite sure how to adapt this to my classroom. And so those conversations are really important. And it also helps us to start move beyond our misconceptions, right? So if we're thinking and seeing through one lens and we have a conversation with some colleagues, you know, we're able to move beyond that. And so that kind of touches back to our taking a pulse principle, as well as that individual learning plan. But we want to do this as a team. And the last principle, our seventh principle, is engaging in courageous conversations. And I think this principle kind of sums it all up, right? We need to be brave enough to ask the questions, to think about those tough things, because we do know that our growth happens when we have that friction like Angela was talking about earlier. But at the same time, just like we talked about before, we have to be respectful to others. And we have to recognize the fact that one professional learning session, 3 professional learning sessions isn't going to change things, right? It's an ongoing process. We're looking for those small incremental steps, right? Just like with our own students in our classroom, we measure their growth over time and we get excited when we see a student moving from one small moment up to another moment. So we have to allow processing time, right? So having that time to self-reflect, to walk away from something and then come back and say, I had this other question, or I tried this and it didn't quite work out, because these changes in beliefs and practices really occur over time. And so as we go through these principles are to guide you throughout all of your professional learning. I think we have about 2 minutes left. So Angela, let's look at some great stuff. So we want to talk about training our teachers to be culturally responsive. And we know that NAGC is great and they have wonderful resources for us. And so one of them is the Bill of Rights for our students of gifted of color. And so we have a link here for you, but if you do a Google search, it'll pop up. I would definitely recommend pulling it in, bringing it into your classrooms, and posting it, right? But also following the principles. And then as we implement the 7 guiding principles in our professional learning, think about, you know, how can you monitor throughout the year? So if you only have 30 minutes, you know, can you give them that pre-assessment maybe a week before? Can you follow up with them afterwards? And just keep going. It's a continuous process.
What great stuff was I supposed to say?
I thought the next slide had our article link on it, but I guess not.
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think we took that off to make it shorter.
Oh, well, that's perfect because we are actually out of time. It's been 40 minutes. So I would say if you're joining us for this session and you haven't watched the other one that we present in this block, you would definitely want to check it out because we pull some connections and we talk about how we use our 7 principles and our 4-zone professional learning model. Definitely worth checking out, definitely worth hanging out with us again.
And I think if you're watching this live, there's also, I think we are possibly here live during the time, I don't know, I may be just making this up, but I think that during the right time slot, if you're here with us live, we've also been chatting with you and answering your questions live, possibly. Maybe that
Definitely.
happens.
And if we're not really live, you can send us an email and we will have an email conversation with you as well. Check us out in the program.
Oh, wait, no, we do have. Here's the article.
All right, friends, we've run out of time. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you and bye.
Bye. I know what I'm doing.